Hello, welcome to I Remember When with the Fitchburg Historical Society, a 30-minute program about Fitchburg history. I'm Susan Navarre, Executive Director at the Fitchburg Historical Society. In today's program, we will look at some aspects of Fitchburg's music history.
I'm Mary Chapin Durling, and I was the Cultural Affairs Coordinator at Fitchburg State College at the time, which then changed to Fitchburg State University. I was the director of Center Stage at Fitchburg State, and I was responsible for events in the president's office and had the delight of being one of the members of Reach. With Barbara, I have this memory, she'll probably remember, of climbing to the top of Rollstone Hill and in around the quarries. You know that are up there. There are actually big holes, and you can then look back at the city, and for her that gave her a true sense of the land, how the river did come, how it carved its way through the city. And I think you then hear that at the very, very beginning of her piece when it's the glacier. And that was the joy of Center Stage. We're not looking to program a specific kind of music. I really strove to bring a wide variety of music, and some of it very challenging.
Hello, I'm Dr. Amy McLaughlin. I am a professor in the music area of the Humanities Department at Fitchburg State University, and I'm here today with Barbara White, who is a composer and professor of music at Princeton University. There are a lot of ethnic pockets in Fitchburg, even still today, and we have a very large population of Finnish immigrants here in town. And they have a very large cultural center here in town as well. And I know that you incorporated a Finnish song into your piece. And I was wondering what you could tell me about your interaction with the Finnish community and perhaps how you chose this piece as well.
Sure. First of all, the piece is called Metsäkukkia, which I was told means flowers of the forest, and it pops up here and there on folk albums and so on. And I was first introduced, I think it was by Ruth Penka from the Historical Society, also maybe by Mary Chapin Durling, who was my closest contact, most consistent kind of contact through the whole piece. She's sort of like my guide. One or both of them put me in touch with Jonathan Ratila from the Finnish newspaper, and he was really helpful in my research. I've since learned from Susan Navarre that he was interested in history through his whole life, so that makes sense to me. So he told me that that particular song would be well known, and so I studied it or got to know the song and ended up including that in the piece. And I can say more about how, because there's some significance to how. But first of all, in terms of the Finnish community, again, this is the kind of thing that wouldn't surprise a historian, but I've learned more around that time of doing the piece in 2000 and since about these sort of pockets of populations at different areas in the United States. So that, there can be a kind of deeply rooted and consistent population that has roots in another country. So that happens in different places. There are different populations, like Somalian population in Minnesota, and the Scottish population in Nova Scotia, but there was also a Lebanese population there that I would not have known about until I read about it. So along those lines, the Finnish population in Fitchburg was really interesting and also really deeply rooted, I understand, over many generations. So that when I came to Fitchburg, it was before 2000 to start working on the piece. I learned about the club and the park and so on, and also that there was the newspaper that I mentioned earlier, and that younger people still spoke the language, even if they were maybe even third or fourth generation. I think that's true. So the language had been kept alive. I was fascinated by that, and something that came out of the song melody Metsäkyykiä was that it was recognizable to people in the area, certainly the Finnish population. I think probably most of the Finnish population would know that song, perhaps. Whereas with the other music actually written in Fitchburg, I think it had been forgotten. So I mentioned the hymn tune, which wasn't written there, but was published in Massachusetts. I don't know if anyone would still have been singing that or know that in the 20th, 21st century. The polkas, perhaps, I think people do know about them, but something like Metsäkyykiä was really familiar, very familiar tune that people could probably sing and so on. And there's a story about how that came out in the piece that I can tell you. So I mentioned earlier the different musics that I'd incorporated into the piece. The ones I've mentioned so far are ones that are in the orchestra piece. So it's an overture that weaves together music that might have been composed in Fitchburg or heard there or performed there and so on. But the ending piece of the overture is a march, which was also able to be detached from the rest. Mary Chapin Durling called it the detachable march. And the idea of that was that then the high school band could play the march in the Independence Day parade. So the overture ends with the march, but the march can be done on its own. And Metsäkyykiä comes into play in the march in a particular way, which is to say that when I was asked to write a march for the Independence Day celebration in Fitchburg, I didn't know there already was one, and actually more than one. So I ran across the Rollstone Cycle Club March. I believe that's by William D. Hall. Yes, it is, published in 1897. And I adapted that and worked with that and played with it for the main parts of the march. But as you know, and others will know, there's a middle section of a march. And for that, I used Metsäkyykiä. Now, the thing is that Metsäkyykiä is I think some might call it a waltz. It's in 3/4 time, but we march in 2 because we have 2 legs. So when I took the waltz to work it into the march, I adapted the rhythm and put it from 3 into 2. And it was very gratifying to me that members of the Finnish population, when they heard the performance, they recognized Metsäkyykiä, but even better, they recognized that I had worked it. And maybe some liked it, maybe some didn't, but I love being able to make I don't know if it's a musical joke, but it's like I don't know, hopefully a bit of wit
Yes.
that people can actually appreciate. And in other kinds of music that I do, sometimes that wouldn't be possible because the music might be less familiar, more obscure, and so on. So to work with these familiar materials is really delightful, and to be able to make that connection to people who know the local music.
So one of the large fixtures in town is the Rollstone boulder, which you feature in your piece. And the Rollstone boulder, which was previously on top of the hill where the quarry is, was moved down to the common, supposedly before it could roll down the hill on its own. And I was wondering, in what way did you use the story of the boulder in your piece?
Yeah, that was certainly a lively aspect of the local lore, and that also is something Mary Chapin Durling told me about. It's probably the first thing I saw when I came to Fitchburg to do research. And first of all, this is not surprising, there was a lot of reference to the boulder in the music that I found in the archives. So I've mentioned some already, the Rollstone Cycle Club March and the Rollstone Polka and so on. There was also a really interesting piece from the bicentennial in 1964 by Madeline Gaynor, which was a song, I think, about the Rollstone boulder that actually referred in the lyrics to be sung, it referred to porphyritic granite. And I was tickled that someone had set the word porphyritic to music. I don't know if that's happened ever before or since. So there's a whole bunch of music that she composed, and I think some people would still remember that event and remember her. And so about the boulder itself, it was explained to me that, you know, all sorts of colorful things about kids going up there to party. And then I've learned from Susan Navarre that, you know, it was also a matter of wanting to continue quarrying in the area. And so I was introduced to all of that. And I understand, as you alluded to, that the boulder never did fall, it was taken down. But in writing my piece, I have the freedom to make things up. I mean, that's my job. So I made up the idea of the boulder falling. And it's very simple. As it happens, in terms of local color, you're probably hearing the siren in my neighborhood, which is an ancient siren for the volunteer fire department that people fight about because some say it's still necessary because the cell service is bad, and others say no, people are just unnaturally attached to this old technology. So that's kind of fitting that that would go off right now.
No kidding. Yeah, tradition is hard to move on from, even if it's not a good one.
Exactly. That's pretty much what my neighbors say. And I'm new here, so I've found it very, you know, I'm kind of tickled that it keeps interrupting my phone calls and things like that. And they're not so tickled, especially people who live closer. So anyway, about the boulder. Yeah, so I created a musical fiction of the boulder rolling down the hill, which is done in kind of, you know, tone painting of music that begins really high and descends fairly quickly to a very low point. It happens right before the march. So it's kind of, as I tried to put things in what might be a sort of historical order, that comes right before, you know, when we hear the late 19th century march from the Cycle Club. So there's some kind of athleticism in there, and then also the Finnish waltz. Yeah, so I enjoyed being able to just imagine things that didn't happen. And then also to use, it's a little bit like what I said about Metsäkyykiä, something being recognizable. So that actual melody is recognizable. For the boulder fiction, I invented the music, but it's also pretty straightforward, like what you might hear in a cartoon or a film. So maybe that musical shape is meaningful to people. Certainly if I tell them, they will recognize, oh, that's the boulder falling. That's the part she talked about.
Yes, when I was looking over the score myself, at first I just kind of, you know, skimmed through, and I immediately could see in the music where you intended for the boulder to be coming down the hill. So not only does it sound that way, but it also looks that way on the score, which is very fascinating.
Yeah, it goes from about as high as, you know, pretty high for the orchestra to about the lowest you can go. So yeah, that's neat that it would show graphically as well.
Great. So the piece was premiered where?
Oh, well, there were two premieres, and one was with the Thayer Symphony Orchestra at the Bernardian Bowl, their annual Independence Day concert. So the orchestra did the full version, the overture and the march, and the high school band premiered the march itself in the band version in the parade, in the Independence Day parade.
Were you there for both performances?
I was, and I think they would both have been on Independence Day, so the parade during the day and the concert at night. I think that's right. So July 4th, 2000.
What was the audience feedback like at the premiere?
It was big, and by that I mean I reflected at the time and since that that was and probably will remain the largest audience my music has been played for. So the number of people at the Bernardian Bowl outside, and that was unusual for me. And at that time, much, not all, but much of my work was sort of in the more rarefied contemporary classical world, and I still exist in that world, but I do a lot of things for much smaller audiences, and it was quite a change, and it made me think a little bit of how we talk about public art and things that, you know, artworks that might be made to be in a public square. In fact, the Rollstone Boulder might be something like that. And versus art that's for a small gallery. And so I kind of felt like I had left the gallery and gone into the public square, which was enjoyable, very unfamiliar. So just having so many people there was quite remarkable. And yeah, I spoke to people who I think I can say, you know, it's a little dangerous to, as a composer, to share only positive feedback about one's own work. But I did, you know, maybe the people who spoke to me were the ones with positive feedback, perhaps. But I did have some nice conversations with concert goers. Like I mentioned, the people who recognized the Finnish tune would talk to me about that. And, you know, some of the other materials, they wouldn't necessarily have been things people knew, like they could sing them, but I think that I like to think the piece came across. And I'm talking more about the orchestral performance, but it was also very gratifying to be at the parade and, you know, see the young people playing this march that, you know, with just the march portion, it's made up of, as I mentioned, the march from 1897, but kind of played with a little bit, and then the Finnish tune in the middle. So I liked the idea that the Finnish tune was being marched.
Were you able to interact more with the orchestra?
I really loved working with this orchestra. I had a good amount of contact with Francis Wada, who was the conductor at that time, who's beloved in the community, and some with the individual musicians. And a really nice thing that happened was that I was invited to give the West lecture at the Historical Society, and there were some musicians from the orchestra who were contracted to participate in that. So I had a small ensemble of maybe 6 people, 6, 8, something like that. And I got to work with them on, it was sort of a preview of the eventual piece. But what I really loved that kind of flexed my intellectual and historical muscles is I got to tell the audience at the lecture about the different Fitchburg musics I had found. It was really about that, and then play them examples. So the examples I've been telling you about of the hymn tune and the Finnish tune and the polka. So people who came to the lecture would get to hear those, but I'd also tell them some of what I'm telling you right now. And in the process, I got to work closely with that subset of the orchestra, which was really nice. So I got to know some people's names. Great. So,
Great.
well, thanks a million.
We would like to thank composer Barbara White for sharing her music with us, and thank both Barbara White and Professor Amy McLaughlin of Fitchburg State University for their aid in creating today's program.